So in today's day and age, I find it very interesting that young adults are consistently put in this situation where it is so much more difficult to buy a property as opposed to the earlier counterparts, boomers and Generation X. Millennials, specifically those from about 1990 and above, have found it a bit difficult to buy property. For the longest period of time, when we look at the way inflation has really played its major point in our economy, and the way inflation has made it such that back then property prices were obviously much lower, but then when you look at the salaries and you looked at the salaries that you were earning, it was a bit on par or a little bit more affordable to be able to buy property, right? And in doing so, we tend to see that boomers and Gen X had more opportunities that allowed them to be in these better financial situations to be able to buy these properties, and then also acquire massive amounts of wealth. Although on the flip side, what we need to realize and what we need to understand is that the internet age and the era of information wasn't freely given. So, there's a bit of give and take to understand the dynamics of why we as young adults have a struggling capacity or are struggling to buy properties to acquire wealth versus the boomers and the Gen X's when they grew up in a society where tech was big and obviously only a few people had it, but information wasn't widely available as it is now. And so we have to look at the dynamic of what did they earn back then versus what do our young adults and millennials earn now? What was the interest rates back then? What are the interest rates now? And then also the criteria as well regarding property. I find it very interesting when it comes to the property aspect because I would classify my parents as Gen X's. And, at the tender age of 2021, when they had me, they were very young. They were able to buy a property and like a one-bedroom apartment for themselves where they were 2021. My mom worked in retail. My dad was earning quite well, obviously, in the printing and packaging sector. But I mean, to be able to buy a property at that age, and being an apprentice, my dad was an apprentice at that point in time, it really goes to show that during those early 90s, it was somewhat easier. And not to say it didn't have its struggles, but I assume that the earning potential back then in relation to what a property costed was minimal. Or maybe not minimal, but I had a better ratio. But let's put it into perspective, right? My dad, from what I know, earned about, maybe around that time, about 10,000. We're talking about like probably mid-90s when I was born. 10,000, and the property that they purchased in the suburbs was about 60,000 rands. When I did the math and the calculation. The same property today is probably going at about 800K. Obviously, they sold back then and whatever. But the thing is, if you look at the ratio, it was like the earning potential of 10 grand versus the property at 60,000. It's absurd, right? When you really think of it. And I'm not to say like everybody in that generation, like Gen X and Boomers, was earning relatively well and decent. But I mean, when you looked at the property prices in relation to like the salaries, those ratios were relatively low compared to now. In this day and age, I mean, the average property price that you have is anywhere in South Africa, average, we're looking at about 750 to 800K. And it also depends on the areas that you want to live in as well, right? You could live in apartments where it's like 850 to over a million. And when I mean average, about 850, I'm talking about apartments that you can generally get about 850. But now with the rising cost of things and lifestyle estates and the way things are going, a lot of apartments are now averaging at about 1.2, 1.3 million for a 1 to 2 bedroom. And as the apartment prices increase, the space of these apartments decrease over time. I've seen scenarios of where one bedrooms used to be about 90 square meters. Now one bedroom factors around 54 square meters. And one bedrooms, back then in terms of price now, chalk and cheese. So I think a major concern that it has for the young adults, that young adults today, or millennials and Gen Zs that are going to face when it comes to real estate, is if boomers and Gen Xers, in terms of your parents, grandparents, or whatever, didn't put properties or finances or trust funds or whatever for you and pass it down to you, or you're going to pass it down to you. If they haven't done that, it's generally going to be very, very difficult, because a lot of people do blame capitalism for what's happening, but we also have to look at it as well. Like, the only way to survive nowadays is to have multiple streams of income, and pretty much with multiple streams of income, have the family pool their money together. And that is so weird when you really think of it, because back then it was a case of, when you finished school, you could go to college, university, you could get your degree, and then you go out and be independent. And I guess they say, yeah, to independence, have your own place, to do things on yourself. And I guess like Gen Xers that have kids, that maybe still preach it onto the kids, didn't realize just how easier it was from an economic perspective. The economy, catered for that. And I know like some of them lived through the time of apartheid, and they even would say things like, yeah, but we didn't have that much opportunities and stuff. But if you really took out that aspect, and if you talk about it in a global sector, South Africa, US, like these global economies in those times still had the opportunity to finish, get a job, and still be able to pay for rent or buy a place with what you were earning. Also back then, when you looked at the lending criteria with banks was, and as I mentioned at the beginning, was much lenient. We look at the crash in 2007, 2008, what happened. And if you watch the movie The Big Short, you would see that the crash happened because banks in America were giving unsecured loans and mortgages to people. And by doing that, people were not able to make their repayments, and eventually, it was the collapse. So if you really think of it, over time, when they tightened the lending criteria, that made it harder based on your salary to qualify for a home loan. When inflation went up, property prices went up. That made it harder based on your salary to buy a property. And when inflation goes up, sometimes salaries don't necessarily scale with the inflation, if you look at it. So that's why it is so much more difficult, and we do find it, a struggle. Now, coming back to the aspect of information being freely available, we have extra expenses in this day and age that boomers and Gen Xers probably did not have back then. I mean, if you think of it, Wi-Fi, your phone bill, anything technological that you purchase, those are things that cost. Nowadays, depending on the country you live in, a car is not a luxury, it's a necessity to get around. If you don't have, or some sort of vehicle can be a necessity. Otherwise, it just makes things so difficult for you. I know there's third world countries out there where obviously the living style is much more simpler, but when we look at what I'm discussing today, elevating your life means, or being able to do the adult things, as we call it, like moving out into your own place and living life, it's actually become a financial burden. And then it creates a perpetual cycle of, now you have to work very hard and then your money goes for all these bills, and it's a perpetual cycle of just working to pay bills and working to pay bills. And then the occasional, like, I will go out and have some fun. Um, and that, to a certain degree, does not allow for us to, or for this, generation up and coming, talking about millennials and Gen Zs, to be able to build wealth. Because if you really think of it, boomers and Gen Xers, when it came to their expenses, they didn't really have as many expenses as we did now. Or they didn't have to deal with all of these technological components that we have to deal now. So, they could buy the house, pay the bills, buy the food, have the vehicle, and that was it. School fees, healthcare, all of that. So I didn't have to worry about buying like what we have, the latest phone or this, latest camera, whatever the technological items we have today. But at the same time, with that being said, the work component also back then was not as, I would say, difficult and strenuous as it is today. So when, older generations tend to say work hard or you're too lazy. But if you look at the amount of work that the younger generation has to do today, it is so much more strenuous and so much more than what the older generations had to do. For example, my grandfather was born in 1945, and a lot of the times he's still in this mindset like things don't take as much time or I correct myself, things that you need to do, you do one or two things for the day and then that's it, right? Because back then, let's just say in a work or office environment, if you were asked to do something, it took time because you didn't have the technological component to do it instantly, right? But now you get an email and you have to frantically scurry and do it and get it all up to date within a matter of minutes and then send it off. When that very same component would have taken them like half the day to do. Maybe not even half the day. I lie, but 30, 45 minutes, an hour. So are we gonna really look at this society and say that we have a bunch of millennials and Gen Zs and Gen Alphas up and coming that are too lazy? Or are we really going to look at the root cause of it and say like the reason why we generally have this issue when it comes to the property market is the prices have gone up, salaries have not increased, and the rising cost of things just make it more difficult. So you focus more on just paying bills as opposed to being able to save up and buy. And the big question is, when I've looked at the data and the statistics, certain areas, when you look at your buyers, a lot of your buyers in certain areas are generally still your Gen Xers. And there are millennials that are buying, but we have to look at who controls most of the wealth, which generation controls most of the wealth, and realize that over time, we've moved into this era of where it was so much easier to build a life and build a family at a time where it's much more difficult. And I guess it does take its toll and effect on real estate. And real estate in its essence in this day and age, a lot of property practitioners are finding it very difficult in the market. And I'm talking about South Africa, because more and more people are unable to afford properties, so people have to rent. So, selling properties are not easy, and even the buying process, a lot of deals maybe fall through. So they focus a lot more on rentals because now people find it a little bit more easier to afford rentals, which then goes to say one thing. And I read this some time ago. Call it conspiracy, but the new world order says you will own nothing and rent everything. So do we really think that the way society is going, it's moving us in that direction of we're not meant to be owning things, but we're meant to just rent things for its period of use, and that's it. So something to think about when looking at back then versus now and comparing yourself to the older gen or even your peers that have gotten wealth handed down and passed on. And if you see people like that, or if you're one of those beneficiaries of that, that's brilliant. But the root cause of it is that society now is not as, or not fair. Not to say it wasn't fair back then, but now it's not as fair as what type of playing field we had back then. Very unequal. So something to think about, because if we don't make some sort of change in our economy, then we may very well end down the path of we will own nothing and rent everything.